When I saw Mr. Eckler heading towards the back of the classroom, I thought nothing of it. In the back corner stood a tiny bathroom for faculty members only. No other classrooms had bathrooms that I knew of, but I never really thought about it or cared. Mr. Eckler led the honors history classes. I looked down at the essay that would count as 10% of our final grade. On the top, in 2 typewritten lines, stood the prompt: explain in detail the benefits and drawbacks of using LSD for torture. I had argued that the risk of causing mystical and spiritual experiences during torture using psychedelics seemed too high, as a mystical experience would likely strengthen the subject to interrogation. I had just finished the last paragraph, contrasting the effects of the CIA's MKUltra with the Soviet Union's use of DMT in interrogations. Sighing, I picked up the essay, looked around for Mr. Eckler, and yet seeing no sign of him. Most of my classmates did not know this yet, as only a few others besides myself had already finished. I saw looks of consternation and utter concentration as they stared down intently at the paper. One Asian kid had his nose practically touching the sheet as he wrote. I had to suppress an urge to laugh at that. Each of the people in this school, called the Watchtower, had their own special ability. Yet, to a random observer, the Watchtower would not have seemed very different, except for the fact that there were no streets, no towns, and no houses in a 200-mile radius. I sat back in my chair, staring at the clock. The second hand circled around, infuriatingly slow and indifferent. The class would end in 5 minutes. Mr. Eckler had gone into the bathroom over half an hour earlier. At this point, I started to wonder if something had gone wrong. Perhaps he had fallen and hit his head? Outside the windows, heavy sheets of wet snow fell over the jagged mountain peaks surrounding the watchtower. They kept us isolated. There were no roads in or out of the area, only a single rail line guarded by armed men in black military gear. Stationed in the Arctic Circle, few people besides Eskimos would even want to live here. Our valedictorian, a fairly attractive girl with a natural tan and flowing auburn hair named Stephanie, finally rose from her seat. She was annoyingly competent at everything she did, and had gotten into classes that Ian and I had not been able to master, like telekinesis and assassination techniques. I tore my gaze away from the window, watching her intently. Pensively, Stephanie walked to the bathroom door, sending nervous glances in every direction. Nearly the entire class had finished the essay by this point, and we all watched her with open interest. I figured I'd let this annoyingly competent teacher's pet take charge. "Mr. Eckler?" Stephanie murmured, knocking lightly on the dull, ancient-looking wooden door a few times. Though she tried to cover it, I noticed her face quickly falling into different expressions, each only lasting a fraction of a second. Uncertainty, consternation, and, finally, disgust and revulsion. I wondered why the latter expressions had arisen for a few moments, until a smell passed by my spot in the middle of the classroom. I wrinkled my nose, uncertain of what had happened for a long time. My first absurd reaction was that it was some horrible cloud of constipated gas released by one of the other nearby students. Like fine wine, I noticed different notes emerging in the fetid odor: feces, rotting meat, blood, and infection. My friend Ian, sitting at the next desk over, immediately rose to his feet, yelling. He had always been somewhat of a class clown, though now his voice had a serious quality I had rarely heard there before. "What the fuck?" he said in his high-pitched, often hilarious voice. "Is that a dead body?" This caused the other students to start looking around nervously at each other. Stephanie continued knocking on the bathroom door, each series of knocks becoming faster and more insistent. "Mr. Eckler? Mr. Eckler?" she yelled, putting her face right up to the door. Her inky eyes glimmered with uncertainty. "Are you okay in there?" I felt a hand grab my shoulder. I looked up to see Ian. Ian had always had a powerful sense of intuition. At times, I felt certain he actually saw the future. As if it were a movie he could fast forward and rewind. He stared at me with eyes the color of ice floating over muddy water. His dilated pupils looked unfocused and unsure on his thin, high-cheekboned face. "Bro, we need to get the hell out of here," Ian whispered into my ear. "Something's not." But he never got to finish his sentence. At that moment, I heard a click. The bathroom door flew open. It smashed into Stephanie's body and sent her flying back. Her arms and legs splayed out and grasping frantically at empty air. The door slammed into the wall with a sound like a car crash, causing the wood to crack and throw splinters in every direction. Inside the threshold, I saw a cyclone of purple light spiraling in a thick veil of fog. Mr. Eckler's voice echoed out, filled with panic. It sounded far away. As he spoke, it grew fainter, as if he were being dragged away at an incredible speed. "Where am I? Who are you?" he cried. "Let go of..." And then we heard him no more. I looked up nervously at Ian, who still stood over me, pulling at my arm. But his face had gone chalk white as he stared open-mouthed at the purple vortex. "I think you're right," I whispered, rising unsteadily to my feet. Side by side, we started towards the open classroom door. The hallways outside sounded as silent as death, and the lights appeared to have gone out, except in our classroom. My sense of uneasiness rose with every step. But before we got to the threshold, screaming erupted, much closer than Mr. Eckler's fading cries. I glanced back to the back of the classroom, seeing strange and monstrous creatures erupting from the spiraling vortex of fog. Scorpions with human faces and long translucent wings like those of a dragonfly flew out in a blur, rising and falling with each beat of their powerful wings. Each looked about the size of a large dog. Their hairless, childlike faces constantly morphed into bizarre expressions of hunger, shock, anger, and sadness, rapidly flicking through each like a slideshow. Their many jointed tails curled in anticipation of fresh meat. At the end, stingers as long as syringes dripped with clear, thick venom. The teens in the back of the classroom scattered like cockroaches, forming a wave of running, stumbling bodies. 3 flying scorpions crashed into them, sending people flying over the desks and through the air in graceful arcs. I saw it happening as if in slow motion. The stinger of one speared through the heart of a girl, slamming her into an upside-down desk with a snapping of ribs and a splash of gore. Before a second victim had even hit the floor, another scorpion had darted forward. Its wings buzzed frenziedly as it grabbed the Asian boy out of the air. Its tail wrapped around him lovingly, almost caressingly, before the dripping stinger sunk into his flesh with a wet thud. The other 2 scorpions reached out their long, skittering legs, picking up more of my classmates as they pleaded for mercy or screamed in terror and agony. They tried to crawl away on the floors, past the pile of jumble of arms and legs, and turned over desks, but the scorpions did not let them get far. "Holy shit!" Ian sat next to me, putting out a hand to stop me. I had been stumbling forwards without even looking where I was going, so horrified and transfixed by the scenes behind me that I couldn't bear to look away. Now, I turned to look through the open threshold, seeing what Ian had already spotted. Something like a hairless dog crouched in the middle of the shadowy hallway. It had 2 red eyes that smoldered like cigarette burns and a mouthful of serrated, jagged teeth. Its skin looked wrinkled and thick, the color of sand. Contained within its powerful jaws, I saw a human arm, the elbow bent and the fingers extended as if reaching out for help. A sharp piece of broken bone protruded from the mutilated patches of gore dripping at the end. The pained shrieking of my classmates rang out from the back. I heard the wails of the dying. The hairless creature slowly drew forward, dropping the arm onto the floor with a wet thud. It started growling, a rising current of rumbling sound that vibrated from its barrel chest. Creeping forward on sharp, curving claws, the color of ivory, it looked ready to pounce at any second. I heard its claws clicking with every step. I thought Ian and I would die right then and there, ripped apart by this hellish abomination with its red eyes and bared teeth jutting out like railroad spikes. I took careful steps back, hearing the whirring of wings drawing closer with each thudding heartbeat. But I was afraid to look away from the hairless wolf creature, anxious that breaking eye contact would cause it to leap for my throat. With a sudden battle cry, Stephanie ran past me, holding the classroom's flagpole in one hand. The American flag streaked past, fluttering wildly, as she speared the sharp end of the metal pole into one of the creature's burning red eyes. It shrieked in a voice like grinding glass, retreating back in the dark hallway in a flash. "Come on!" Stephanie cried, grabbing my arm. I saw blood trickling from a deep gash on her forehead, and one side of her face looked bruised and swollen. I glanced back, seeing most of my classmates laying on the floor, their frozen faces stuck in the rictus grimace of the dead. The sputtering of nerves shook my body as I saw all the gore, the white, sightless eyes staring up into eternity. Two of the scorpions soared through the air in falling and rising currents, heading straight for us. I saw their strange, childlike faces twisted into pained grimaces. Together, Ian, Stephanie, and I ran out of the classroom of horrors, slamming the door shut moments before a flying scorpion smashed into the other side. Across the hallway stood the telekinetics laboratory. I knew it held a variety of potential useful items, including knives, but the door was closed and dark. I looked through the glass pane, but I could see nothing inside. From further down the shadowy hallway, I heard the creeping of many feet. Without hesitation, I gently pulled the door open, wincing as a rusted creaking rang out. I quickly ushered Ian and Stephanie inside, afraid that something had hurt us. As quietly as possible, I closed the door behind us. My eyes adjusted rapidly to the darkness. I realized we were not alone. The bodies of a dozen students lay twisted and broken on the floor. The smell of death rose, thick and rank. Blinking quickly, I looked around for something useful, something that might help us survive. In telekinetics class, students had to juggle knives, bend spoons, stop crossbow bolts from hitting their targets, and all with the power of their minds. Of course, some students had no telekinetic ability at all, including myself and Ian, and were rapidly withdrawn from the class. Stephanie was one of the few remaining students from our year who had what the teacher called natural potential. The class had 8 tables, each set up with 4 chains and a sink. Cuts and injuries were common, especially during final exams, which were finishing tomorrow. After all, this insanity had begun during our final exam in Mr. Eckler's room. "I'm getting something right now, man," Ian said nervously, his eyes flickering back and forth rapidly. "We're not alone. Something bad." His voice trailed off in terror. In the dim light streaming through the tiny barred windows overhead, I saw Ian's pupils dilating and constricting rapidly, dozens of times each second. I knew his precognition had activated. His head ratcheted to face the corner suddenly. I followed his line of sight, seeing something moving. Behind the black-topped tables, a little girl in a faded green nightgown huddled in the corner. Black hair covered her face. The front of her gown looked soaked and matted with fresh blood, as well as drippings of darker and thicker fluids. More crimson droplets fell from her chin with every passing heartbeat. She slowly started rising to her full height, her naked feet cracking and dripping with deep purple sores and infected slices. "My pets," she hissed in a low booming voice. It seemed amplified and unnatural. She giggled, but her laughter gurgled, as if she had a slit throat hidden under all that hair. I glanced nervously over at Stephanie, who had suddenly started backpedaling towards the cabinets against the side wall. I hoped she had a plan, because I certainly didn't. "Your pet?" I asked in a trembling voice. "You mean those things roaming the hallways and classrooms?" The little girl nodded eagerly, her greasy matted hair still hiding what lay underneath. "The door opens sometimes. The pathway between worlds. It is the selection of the strong. The weak deserve to die. And how painfully they go. It brings joy to my heart to see their blue lips and slashed throats. She laughed again, a revolting sound that made my heart palpitate in my chest. "It's a trap," Ian whispered furtively by my side. "Watch the door. They're going to try to..." But he never got to finish his thought, because at that moment, many things happened at once. The classroom door flew open so hard that when it hit the wall, the shatterproof glass pane cracked down the middle. Slinking through the threshold, I saw two hairless hellhounds. One of them had an eye missing. The fiery socket constantly dribbled rivulets of blood down its demonic face. It glared up at Stephanie with a vengeance. I jumped, feeling Ian grab my arm and push me towards the far wall, where Stephanie stood in front of an open cabinet. Her long slender fingers reached through the supplies with precision. A moment later, she withdrew her clenched fists. In each one, I saw a long butcher's knife, the steel tips razor-sharp and gleaming. Without speaking, she flung the two knives straight up in the air. They spun in slow, lazy circles, looking like they would simply fall back down and land in Stephanie's open hands. But a moment later, her arms shot out in a blur. Sparks of blue light sizzled off her skin. They spiraled down her wrists, exploding from the tips of her fingertips as the current connected with the knives. Like rockets, they shot out in different directions, the sharp blades pointing at their victims. The little girl's laughter got cut off abruptly as a knife disappeared in her thick mat of hair with a loud crunch of bone. Furiously, she reached up, the handle still quivering, the blade embedded deeply in the center of her skull. Her hair separated, revealing the horror show hiding underneath. A skinned, eyeless face stared out. The muscles appeared rotted and gray, almost falling off the bone. The exposed facial muscles constantly twitched and contracted in random movements. As she pulled at the knife, more pieces fell off, revealing the grinning skull and broken blackened teeth underneath. The other knife soared through the air and into the wrinkled, sloping forehead of the nearer of the hellhounds. It gave a strangled low cry and fell on its side, its legs still pumping the air furiously. The other kept creeping closer, staying near the ground. Its one red eye shone with light, while the other dribbled black blood in stains from the empty socket. The little girl's bloody hands threw the knife across the room. I saw it soaring toward me, a blur of flashing silver and black. A moment later, it bit into my leg with a numbing, burning sensation. For a few heartbeats, I felt nothing but cold pins and needles radiating out in a circle. From the corner of my eye, I glimpsed the hellhound leaping up on powerful legs. In a streak of beige, it missed me by inches, landing on Stephanie's chest with its crooked claws. A surging agony of pain ran up my leg. I stumbled, landing hard on my chest as the breath whooshed out of my bruised chest. Next to me, Stephanie fell backwards, a strangled scream dying in her throat. The hellhound's claws bit through her skin. With an explosion of blood, Stephanie twisted and writhed beneath the gnashing teeth, her tanned skin rapidly covered in spatters of crimson. Her telekinetic abilities exploded with a flash like blue lightning. Dozens of chairs laying strewn and broken across the room rose, smashing straight up into the ceiling with an ear-splitting shudder. Another bolt of Stephanie's energy hit the hellhound. It flew up in a blur, its one remaining red eye furious and white. It hit the ceiling with a wet crack of bone and flesh. The tiles shattered, blowing apart into an expanding orb of dust. The destruction spread, widening as hidden wires and vents collapsed. Within moments, the cloud of falling debris had grown thick and impenetrable. I heard Stephanie's sweat gurgling nearby, but I could see nothing. Her attack on the ceiling had caused the entire room to start caving in. I dragged myself forward over the debris, my spurting leg rapidly covering my jeans in warm, slick scarlet. Every breath felt like agony. Every twitch of my right leg brought a wave of pain so intense that I nearly passed out. A hand fell on my shoulder. I spun around on my back, nearly screaming, but I immediately started choking on the dust. "It's me," Ian whispered in a small voice, leaning down over me. Through the cloud of debris, I could just barely make out his silhouette. "Follow me." He wrapped his arms around me, helping me to my feet. After putting an arm around my back, we staggered forward together as if we were in a three-legged race. We stumbled in the direction of the door, trying to get away from the insane little girl and her pets. Behind us, Stephanie's death gasps rang out, weakening with every bloody breath. By the time we made it to the door, she had gone silent. In the dark hallway, I saw long trails of drying blood, but no signs of any people or cryptids. The few windows opening up onto the Alaskan mountains allowed some of the snowy light to enter, but the shadows seemed unnaturally thick and persistent, leaving only a world of silhouettes and dim horrors. I heard no sign of the demonic girl. In the room we had just left, nothing seemed to stir. A powerful sense of hope gripped me then. Perhaps we had killed her? "You need medical attention," Ian murmured. I looked down at my leg, seeing the knife's handle still sticking out like the quill of a porcupine. It had landed in the fleshy part of my thigh, missing the bone by a hair's width. "Why don't you use your ability?" I stared at him in horror. "No freaking way," I said quietly. "When I change, I can't control it. I might kill you and everyone left alive. There is no human thought left when that happens, and I can't control how long I stay like that either. I could be gone for days or weeks." "You might not have a choice," he said. "At this point, I don't think there are a lot of people left alive, and the chances of us both making it out are tiny. If you changed, the wound in your leg wouldn't affect you nearly as much." I knew he was right in that. If I changed, the wound would probably not affect me at all in truth. But the endless, maddening waves of hunger would. "No, fuck that," I said. "We need to find help. What's your intuition saying?" I hoped Ian's precognitive talents would allow him to see the right path forward. "Maybe if we can make it to the train, we can alert the guards." "You act like they don't already know what's happening," he said. "They probably do, but they just don't care. Why else would they build this school in the middle of a mountainous wasteland?" "To keep us as prisoners," I answered. He laughed. "I think there's something else in here they want to keep imprisoned far more than us." He looked both ways down the hallway, unsure of what to do. I stared intently at the closed door to Mr. Eckler's classroom. The power in the room had apparently gone out. It sounded as quiet as a corpse in there. I wondered what had happened to the flying scorpions. The door suddenly flew open. I screamed, nearly falling on my bed leg. Ian gave a gasp like a strangled cat, his arm tightening around my back. Through the dim snowy light entering through the windows, I saw Mr. Eckler. His button-up shirt and slacks looked absolutely shredded, revealing deep slices dribbling rivulets of blood down his chest and legs. One of the lenses of his black glasses had shattered, and the other had fallen out entirely. He stared blankly at us, his normal jovial rounded face a mask of horror and trauma. Behind him lay the broken bodies of students. I also saw one of the flying scorpions laying upside down, its once beige exoskeleton now cracked and blackened, as if it had been roasted over a bonfire. "Oh, thank God," Mr. Eckler whispered upon seeing us. "I thought everyone had already died. Jesus, what a mess." He shook his head slowly, his pale face matted and covered in sweat. "Mr. Eckler?" Ian mumbled nervously. "We thought you were dead. What happened?" Mr. Eckler gave a long, weary sigh. "I really don't know, Ian," he said. "One moment, I was in the bathroom, and everything seemed normal. The next moment, however, the back wall started moving away from me. Within a few seconds, the bathroom had extended to something the size of a football stadium. The lights darkened and strobed until everything turned purple, and mist started to flow out of the walls until I couldn't see. I had no idea where I was, or even which direction to go. But that was far from the worst of it. The next thing I remember, something in the mist had grabbed me. At first I couldn't see, but I felt its teeth in my arm. He raised his right wrist, where deep bite marks gleamed on the pale skin. More of these things came. They looked like hairless dogs. One of them jumped on me and cut me down to the ground before I could react. It slashed me over and over until I was forced to use my ability. Mr. Eckler had never told us about his ability, though I knew all teachers at the watchtower had one. I looked at the burnt body of the scorpion. "You burned them?" I asked. He nodded. "I can create fire, yes," he said. Pyrokinesis, they call it. An extremely dangerous talent, I must admit. When I was a boy, I accidentally burned down my whole house, trying to clear imaginary monsters from under my bed. Of course, there were no monsters, but I accidentally killed both my parents. The government found out what happened and took me here, back when the watchtower was first being built. "Can you help us get to safety?" "Sully got stabbed in the leg," Ian said, motioning to me with a subtle nod of his head. Yes, of course," Mr. Eckler said, nodding brusquely. "Forgive my rudeness. We need to get you to evacuate it immediately." He looked right and left down the hallway, his pale eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. But everything looked dead and silent now. I wondered if it was a trap. After a few moments of hesitation, Mr. Eckler went left towards the train station and away from the medical supply room. Every step made the pain in my leg shriek with a sizzling of nerves and fresh streams of blood. I felt lightheaded and weak, and I knew if I lost much more blood, I would probably pass out. Ian watched me closely as we followed Mr. Eckler through the shadowy hallways. He strode slowly forward in front of us, a dark silhouette like the angel of death. "I have a bad feeling about this," Ian whispered nervously. "I can't see why, but it's like something is squeezing my heart. I don't know if I'm just scared or if it's a premonition. I can't see beyond the dread." The dozens of bodies of students and more hellhounds and flying scorpions littered every part of the school. Every classroom we passed seemed like a nightmare of broken bodies and carnage. I couldn't wait to get out of the watchtower. I wanted to leave this place forever. We descended the stairs and found the door leading to the train station wide open. Thick, wet snowflakes blew in through the threshold, accompanied by strong winds and freezing blasts of cold. Two men in black military gear lay dead outside, their hands reaching out toward the doorway, even in death. The snow had begun covering their corpses by this point, but peeking out under the white covering, I saw the silhouette of a black rifle. "Oh no," Mr. Eckler said, putting his hand over his mouth. "How are we going to get out of here now?" I had no answer to that. Ian looked nervously past the dead bodies at the sleek train looming overhead, its black surface shining and covered in fresh drifts of snow. "We have to figure out how to operate the train," I said. "It's the only way I can see to get us all out of here. Even if we could reach the outside world, no one could send a helicopter or plane in this." Mr. Eckler looked pensive and thoughtful for a long moment, then nodded. "Stay close by my sides then," he said, heading outside. Nervously, Ian and I followed closely behind. Ian and I hadn't taken more than a couple steps outside when I felt his grip abruptly release, sending me tumbling into the thick blanket of snow underfoot. A surprised shriek rang out, muffled and carried off by the roaring winds. I looked up, seeing Ian stumbling blindly forwards, the hilt of a large meat cleaver emerging from the side of his neck. The blood spurted straight out of his jugular vein, shooting forwards like water from a squirt gun. He clawed at the hilt, both of his hands wrapping around it before he fell forward. His pupils dilated, his eyes glassy and filled with horror. The white snow turned crimson underneath him. Behind him, the little girl with the black hair stood. The wind whipped her hair back, showing a face like a skull. Her insane rictus grin was marked by the large, ragged tears caused by the knife Stephanie had shot at her. But the girl had apparently pulled it out. Pieces of torn gray flesh hung down from her skinned cheeks and rotted sinus cavities Are these the last of the sacrifices? The girl gurgled, turning to look at Mr. Eckler. He nodded grimly, glancing down at me one last time. All of the students are dead, my queen, he said. And you will be rewarded greatly for your service, she said. Their abilities flow through their blood like sand, carried away by water, and once you have ascended, you will be able to absorb their powers, like me. I started crawling away through the freezing snow. The demon girl and Mr. Eckler continued talking, whispering in low voices. A moment later, the girl kneeled down over Ian's body and drank from the still spurting wound on his neck. Her lipless mouth sucked greedily, her blackened cracked teeth gnashing hungrily. I felt a strong hand grab me by the back of the neck, lifting my head up. I stared up into the insane blue eyes of Mr. Eckler. I wish I could say I was sorry about this, but truthfully, I'm not, he hissed, his voice changing from the teacher I had once known into something rambling and unhinged. I will live forever, and for that, a price must be paid. At that moment, I knew I had nothing left to lose. Kill him now, the girl cried from behind us. This boy can glimpse the future, and with its blood in me, I can see too. That one needs to die now. Now! Mr. Eckler's eyes widened, his hands growing hot with flame as I completely let go within my mind. The reptilian blood laying hidden within me erupted, and then all human thoughts disappeared. My skin rippled and distorted, turning black and shiny like that of a snake's. Long claws ripped their way out of my fingers and toes, shredding my toes to ribbons in a heartbeat. Mr. Eckler's burning hands stayed firmly wrapped around my neck, but they had no effect on the thick reptilian exoskeleton. Dozens of fangs grew from my gums. My sense of smell grew exponentially. With every flick of my long tongue, I could taste the air, even able to notice the odor of rotting bodies far back in the building. With the pain in my leg temporarily gone, I flew to my feet, slashing and biting furiously at the air. I felt my scales growing hot as Mr. Eckler hung on with his life. The black scales started dripping, running like oil down my tall lizard-like body. He tried to pull back as my claws connected with his arm, ripping it open down to the bone. But I lunged forward and grabbed him by the neck with my teeth. I tasted the explosion of salty blood as it filled my mouth. In my reptilian state, it tasted sweet and powerful. The girl used her abilities to lift up the body of one of the dead soldiers. With a discharge of blue lightning from her hands, the body flew across the air in a blur, slamming hard into the side of my head. I went flying into the concrete wall of the school, cracking the cement as I hit it. Clawing blindly at the air, I pushed myself back to my feet and sprinted at the girl. Something like a blue lightning bolt flew from her body, causing the ground at my feet to open up with a deep black fissure. At the same instant, I leapt, feeling the air and snow crumbling beneath my feet. I soared through the air. The girl's eyeless sockets spun with darkness and sickness. I crashed into her body, instantly driving my claws into her small chest and ripping up. She gurgled, trying to crawl out from under me. But I opened my wide, reptilian mouth and closed my sharp fangs around her neck. She gave one final hiss as I ripped out her throat, still twitching and kicking. I continued biting and shredding until her small head tore off her body. With pieces of the spine poking out of the bottom, I left it there, loping off into the snowy wastelands of Alaska. I don't know how long I traveled or how far. In my animal state, time felt fluid and strange. I remember sprinting over high jagged mountains and thick evergreen woodlands, hunting and killing as I went. Alaska had plenty of game for a natural hunter like myself, and even the polar bears and moose avoided me once they smelt the predatory reptilian pheromones of my transformed state. But I always felt hungry, even after I had just tasted fresh meat. Weeks later, I finally transformed back. I found myself in a cold, dark cabin. Next to me lay the body of a hunter I had murdered and eaten. I barely remembered doing it. Everything blurred together, and the different tastes of deer, bear, or human meat barely registered in my reptilian brain. Sickened by what I had done, I went around the cabin, taking thick clothes and new shoes from the dead hunter. I went outside, and to my immense relief, I found a small town only a few miles away. From there, I made my way back to the mainland, always blending in with the crowds. I still stay on the run. The government sent me to that hall of death in the first place after all. And, for all I know, they think I died there. And, if so, I have no desire to change. That belief